The nurse did not flinch when the chair crashed against the tiled floor, but every frightened patient in the emergency waiting room did. A little girl buried her face against her grandfather's shoulder, an elderly couple stopped whispering mid-sentence, and even the buzzing fluorescent lights seemed to hum more sharply as three broad-shouldered men shoved through the crowded entrance, dragging a bleeding companion between them as though the hospital belonged to them alone. The smell of antiseptic mixed with rain-soaked jackets and fresh coffee hung heavily in the air, but it was quickly swallowed by the sharper scent of fear. The tallest of the men slammed his fist onto the reception counter, demanding immediate treatment, his voice echoing against white walls already carrying the weight of too many emergencies. Nurses hurried between trauma rooms, monitors beeped in uneven rhythms, stretchers rolled past with practiced urgency, and every member of the staff understood the same painful truth that every emergency department lived by. Someone always had to wait because someone else was closer to dying. Standing behind the counter was Evelyn Brooks, a veteran emergency nurse whose calm expression had been forged through 22 years of impossible choices. Tiny silver strands escaped the knot in her dark hair, faint lines framed tired but observant eyes, and her blue scrubs carried the creases of another 12-hour shift that had quietly become 16. She looked once toward the trauma bay where a teenage accident victim fought for every breath, then back toward the furious men whose anger was beginning to infect the entire room. She did not raise her voice. She simply explained that their injured friend had already been assessed by the triage nurse and would be treated according to the severity of his condition, just like everyone else waiting. The words landed like sparks on dry grass. One man leaned over the counter until they were nearly face to face. He called her heartless. Another accused the hospital of letting people die. The third kicked over a waste bin, scattering paper cups and crumpled tissues across the polished floor. Several patients instinctively moved farther away while parents shielded their children without taking their eyes off the confrontation. Evelyn's heartbeat quickened, but years of experience had taught her that panic was contagious. Calm could be contagious too, if someone was willing to carry it first. She looked directly at the tallest man and spoke with the same measured tone she used when comforting frightened children before surgery. "This is a hospital," she said. "Everyone here is someone's family. Take one more step toward violence, and you will regret it." The warning was not loud. It carried no threat, no anger, only certainty. For a single heartbeat the waiting room became perfectly still. Then laughter exploded from the group. Loud, mocking laughter that bounced through the room with cruel confidence. The tallest man clapped sarcastically while another grinned as though he had just heard the funniest joke of the year. They believed the nurse's composure was weakness. They believed kindness meant helplessness. Around them, no one laughed. A young mother held her sleeping infant closer. An elderly veteran wearing a faded baseball cap quietly folded his newspaper without looking up. A paramedic paused halfway through a doorway, silently judging the distance in case he needed to intervene. Near the corner of the room sat an older man in a worn brown jacket, faded jeans, and heavy work boots that had clearly seen better years. A small canvas backpack rested beside his chair. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, his weathered hands were folded across the handle of a wooden cane, and a fresh scar disappeared beneath the collar of his shirt. Beside him sat a girl no older than 8, hugging a stuffed sea turtle whose fabric had faded from years of being loved. She whispered questions about her mother's surgery every few minutes, and each time the old man answered with patient reassurance that never sounded rehearsed. Earlier that evening, when another frightened toddler had begun crying uncontrollably after seeing an ambulance crew rush past, the old man had quietly folded a paper crane from an old appointment form and handed it to the child without saying a word. Evelyn had noticed. She had smiled as she hurried by and softly thanked him. He had simply nodded before returning to his granddaughter. Neither of them had imagined that small exchange would matter before the night was over. The shouting grew louder. One of the aggressive men stepped around the reception counter despite repeated orders to stop. A security guard moved toward him, but another man deliberately blocked his path, forcing him backward. Patients gasped as voices rose into angry echoes. Somewhere deeper inside the hospital, an emergency code was announced over the intercom, but few people in the waiting room heard it anymore. Fear had narrowed their world to this single moment. Evelyn pressed the silent alarm beneath the counter with one careful movement, while refusing to break eye contact with the man advancing toward her. She knew security would come. She also knew they might not arrive quickly enough. Still, she refused to retreat because behind her were medication carts, vulnerable patients, and co-workers already overwhelmed with lives hanging in the balance. She could not allow chaos to spill deeper into the department. The tallest man sneered at her unwavering expression and asked whether she really thought anyone would stop him. His friends laughed again, feeding one another's arrogance until it became something dangerous. Evelyn answered only by standing straighter. The room seemed to shrink around them. Every monitor beep sounded farther away. Every breath felt louder. The little girl in the corner clutched her grandfather's sleeve so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The old man gently covered her hand with his own, his eyes never leaving the unfolding confrontation. There was no anger in his face. No fear either. Only the quiet focus of someone measuring every doorway, every distance, every movement without appearing to move at all. The nurse noticed it for only a fraction of a second before the moment shattered. The tallest man suddenly reached across the counter and seized Evelyn's wrist with enough force to make several patients cry out. Papers scattered into the air. A coffee cup rolled across the floor. The security guard shouted as he pushed forward through the confusion. And in the same instant, the old man released his granddaughter's hand, rose slowly from his chair despite the slight limp in his left leg, and fixed the attacker with a steady gaze that carried the unmistakable weight of a man who had spent a lifetime giving dangerous people one final chance to make a better decision. The waiting room seemed to stop breathing. The coffee cup that had been rolling across the polished floor finally tipped onto its side, its thin stream of dark liquid creeping silently between scattered papers while every frightened pair of eyes shifted toward the old man who had just risen from his chair. He did not rush. He did not clench his fists. He simply rested one weathered hand on the curved handle of his cane, his posture relaxed enough to seem ordinary yet balanced enough to suggest that every movement had already been considered. His granddaughter looked up at him with wide, trusting eyes. She did not cry. She simply nodded when he whispered that everything would be all right. The words were spoken so gently that only she could hear them, but somehow they steadied the room more than the shouting ever had. The tallest aggressor tightened his grip on Evelyn's wrist, smiling as though he enjoyed having an audience. The nurse refused to struggle. Years in emergency medicine had taught her that panic often invited greater violence. She met the old man's eyes for only an instant, silently hoping he would stay back. She had seen too many good people get hurt trying to help. The stranger answered her concern with the smallest shake of his head, as if telling her that fear would not decide what happened next. He stepped forward, the faint tap of his cane against the tile echoing through the unnatural silence. "Stop," he said, his voice calm enough to disappear beneath ordinary conversation yet somehow impossible to ignore. "Let her go. That is your last opportunity to leave this room with your dignity." The words carried no anger, only certainty. For a heartbeat even the aggressors hesitated. Then the laughter returned, louder than before. One man looked at the cane and smirked. Another glanced at the gray in the stranger's beard and nudged his friend with an amused grin. The tallest man leaned closer, still gripping Evelyn's arm, and mocked the old man's age, asking whether retirement homes had started sending security guards to hospitals. More laughter followed. It spread through the group like fuel poured onto a fire. The old man remained perfectly still. His breathing never changed. His shoulders stayed loose. Evelyn noticed something then that her exhausted mind had almost overlooked. It was not his confidence. It was his awareness. His eyes never lingered on one threat for more than a second. They moved naturally, almost invisibly, measuring exits, distances, reflections in the windows. The position of every frightened patient, every child, every obstacle that could become either danger or protection. She had seen that level of awareness only once before, years earlier, when military medics had accompanied wounded soldiers into the emergency department. Before she could finish the thought, the room became strangely quiet. One of the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A heart monitor somewhere beyond the double doors emitted its steady rhythm. Rain tapped softly against the glass entrance. No one moved. No one spoke. The silence lasted only a few seconds, yet it felt impossibly long, stretching across the room until even the attackers seemed uncertain why they had stopped laughing. The old man spoke again. "If you choose violence now, you will remember this moment for the rest of your life." The tallest aggressor answered with a shove. It was fast, careless, and completely underestimated the man standing before him. The cane slipped effortlessly aside. The old man pivoted no more than half a step. The attacker lost his balance as his own momentum carried him forward, crashing shoulder first into the reception counter before he even understood what had happened. His grip on Evelyn's wrist broke instantly. Before the other two could react, the old man guided one arm harmlessly away from a frightened patient, redirected another wild swing into empty space, and used nothing more than precise leverage to send the second aggressor stumbling onto a row of vacant chairs. Metal legs scraped loudly across the floor. Gasps filled the room. The third man lunged with reckless fury, but every strike met only empty air. The older man's movements were astonishingly economical. No wasted motion. No unnecessary force. Every step protected patients first, creating distance between danger and the innocent before addressing the attackers themselves. Within seconds, the third aggressor found himself pinned face down against the floor, unable to move without hurting only himself. The entire confrontation ended so quickly that several witnesses were still trying to understand what they had seen. The old man never raised his voice. He never struck anyone after the threat had ended. The moment each attacker stopped resisting, so did he. Evelyn stared in disbelief. The security guards finally reached the reception area, taking control of the restrained men while officers rushed through the entrance moments later, responding to the silent alarm. Parents hugged their children. The elderly couple who had frozen in fear only minutes earlier quietly began helping gather the scattered papers from the floor. The little girl with the stuffed sea turtle ran straight to her grandfather, wrapping both arms around his waist. He smiled warmly, resting one gentle hand on her shoulder as though nothing extraordinary had happened. One police officer approached the old man with routine questions, notebook already in hand. Then he paused. His expression changed completely. Recognition replaced procedure. The officer lowered his notebook, stood a little straighter, and looked at the older man with unmistakable respect. "Sir, is that really you?" The waiting room fell silent again. Another officer turned, following his partner's gaze. His eyes widened. "I knew I recognized him," he murmured. "That's Chief Marcus Hale. Retired Navy SEAL. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. The man who led civilian rescue operations overseas after retiring." The whispers spread through the room faster than the earlier panic had. Patients who had seen only an aging grandfather now looked at him with stunned disbelief. Marcus Hale seemed almost uncomfortable with the attention. He gave the officers a polite nod and quietly corrected them. "Retired a long time ago. Tonight I'm just a grandfather waiting for news about my daughter." He looked toward Evelyn, whose wrist was already beginning to bruise. His expression softened with genuine concern. "Are you hurt?" She looked at the faint marks on her arm before meeting his eyes again. For the first time since the confrontation began, emotion threatened to break through her professional composure. She slowly shook her head. "No," she answered softly. "Thanks to you." Marcus glanced around the waiting room, making sure every frightened child, every elderly patient, and every exhausted nurse was safe before saying something so quiet that those closest barely heard it. "No. Thanks to you. You stood your ground long before anyone else did." The room understood then that the greatest act of courage had begun before the veteran ever stood from his chair, and yet no one could have guessed that the night's deepest revelation was still waiting just beyond the doors of the operating wing, where news about Marcus's daughter was about to change the meaning of everything they thought they knew. The operating room doors opened with a slow mechanical hiss that drew every eye away from the aftermath of the confrontation. The police officers stepped aside. The security guards loosened their tense shoulders. Even the 3 men who had filled the hospital with shouting only minutes earlier turned instinctively toward the corridor. A surgeon, still wearing a surgical cap and mask pulled beneath his chin, walked into the waiting area with the deliberate pace of someone who had carried both hope and heartbreak through too many hallways. His tired eyes searched the room until they found Marcus Hale. The old veteran stood immediately, not with the confidence of a decorated warrior but with the quiet uncertainty of a father waiting to hear whether his daughter would live. Beside him, his granddaughter reached for his hand without saying a word. For the first time that night, the man who had faced violence without hesitation looked genuinely afraid. The surgeon stopped in front of him and smiled. The operation was successful. She is stable. There will be a long recovery, but she is going to make it. Marcus closed his eyes. His shoulders lowered almost imperceptibly as though an invisible weight he had carried for hours had finally been lifted. He did not celebrate. He did not shout. He simply whispered a heartfelt thank you before kneeling to embrace his granddaughter. The little girl buried her face against his shoulder, her stuffed sea turtle squeezed tightly between them, and the waiting room, which only moments before had echoed with anger, became filled with something far stronger than relief. It became filled with gratitude. Evelyn watched the reunion from behind the reception desk, gently rotating her bruised wrist. One of her fellow nurses offered to finish the paperwork, but she quietly declined. There were still patients waiting. Medication still needed to be given. Lives still depended on ordinary acts of care. Marcus noticed. As soon as he was certain his daughter was safe, he walked back toward the nurse instead of accepting the attention gathering around him. Reporters had not arrived. Cameras were absent. There was no audience except frightened families, exhausted doctors, and officers finishing their reports. That suited him perfectly. He thanked Evelyn for protecting her patients even when she knew she could be hurt. She answered with a tired smile, insisting that she had only done her job. Marcus looked around the emergency department where nurses hurried between rooms, doctors reviewed scans, janitors quietly cleaned the mess left behind by the confrontation, and volunteers comforted anxious relatives. Then he said something that settled over the room like a gentle truth. Courage rarely announces itself. Most days it simply clocks in on time. No one spoke. The sentence lingered in the silence because everyone knew someone it described. The paramedic who skipped family dinners to answer emergency calls. The receptionist who greeted grieving families with patience she no longer had the energy to feel. The janitor who quietly disinfected rooms after tragedy so strangers would have a clean place to heal. Heroism, they realized, was often wearing ordinary clothes. One of the arrested men, his arrogance finally stripped away, lowered his eyes as officers prepared to escort him outside. He stared at the bruises beginning to form on Evelyn's wrist and then at the little girl holding her grandfather's hand. Shame settled across his face far more heavily than the handcuffs around his wrists. He asked if he could say something before leaving. The officers hesitated before allowing him a single moment. He looked directly at Evelyn and struggled to find the words. He apologized, not because he had been defeated, but because for the first time he understood what he had nearly destroyed. He admitted that he had mistaken patience for weakness and compassion for something that could be bullied. Then he turned toward Marcus. "I thought strength meant making people afraid of you," he said quietly. Marcus regarded him with calm eyes that held neither hatred nor triumph. "Real strength," he replied, "is making sure the people around you no longer have a reason to be afraid." The words settled deeply into every corner of the waiting room. They were not spoken as a lesson. They were spoken as a life that had already proved them true. The officers led the men away without another struggle. As the entrance doors closed behind them, the storm outside had finally begun to pass. Thin rays of early morning sunlight slipped through the hospital windows, painting long golden reflections across the polished floor where spilled coffee had already been cleaned away. It was as though the building itself had quietly exhaled. Before anyone could thank him again, Marcus picked up his worn canvas backpack and reached for his granddaughter's hand. Evelyn stopped him for one last moment. She disappeared briefly into the staff room and returned carrying the small paper crane he had folded for the frightened toddler hours earlier. The child had left with her parents after the danger ended, but she had insisted the nurse give it back to the kind grandfather who made her smile. Marcus accepted the delicate paper bird with visible surprise. He turned it over carefully in his weathered hands as though it were something priceless. His granddaughter smiled. "We're keeping it," she whispered. He nodded. "Yes, we are. Because sometimes the smallest things remind us who we chose to be." Together they walked slowly toward the exit. The automatic doors opened, welcoming the cool morning air. No applause followed them. No speeches were made. Within minutes another ambulance arrived, another family rushed through the entrance, and the hospital returned to its endless rhythm of quiet battles fought every hour of every day. Marcus disappeared into the dawn exactly as he had arrived, unnoticed by most of the world, content to let the headlines belong to someone else. Evelyn adjusted her name badge, took one steady breath, and returned to the next patient waiting for help. The bruises on her wrist would fade. The memory of that night would not. Some people carry medals that the world can see. Others carry invisible scars that shape every gentle decision they make. In the end, the greatest victories are not the ones won with force but the ones that leave kindness standing after fear has gone. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who still believes quiet courage can change an ordinary day, because the strongest hearts are often the ones that never need to prove how strong they are.